Hello, this is Jeanette Shaliga with VGA, and our next birthday celebration presentation is from David Ryan, and he's going to be talking about getting into the habit, researching nuns in your family tree. David, thank you so much for sharing this topic with us. The time is all yours.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and happy birthday to VGA. So it's wonderful that it's been here for 5 years, and I'm looking forward to many more. So as the title suggests, I am going to be talking about nuns in your family tree. Now, just a very quick disclaimer. I'm using the term nun as a sort of blanket term. I'm aware that there are, I suppose, technical distinctions between nuns and religious sisters. But just to keep it simple, I'll stick with nuns. So again, why research nuns? Why should we be interested? Well, I'm assuming that at least a few of you watching this probably come from a Catholic background, or maybe you were just educated in a Catholic school. Maybe you have Catholic relatives. And there's a very good chance that you will have somebody in your family tree who was a nun. And I know certainly, in my own family, back as far as my grandparents' generation, was kind of always assumed that at least one girl would probably decide to become a nun. And it may seem strange to us nowadays, but for a long time, it was kind of seen as a third option for a lot of girls and young women, because particularly in conservative countries like Ireland, there weren't that many options. You could either get married, have a family, spend all your time as housewife, or if you didn't, you were probably going to be stuck at home acting as a carer for your relatives. There weren't a lot of opportunities for education or travel. And paradoxically, by entering a convent, quite often they would actually have access to more options. They would have a chance to gain a career of sorts. They would often get training and much more of an education. And if that particular religious order was involved in missions abroad, they would also maybe get an opportunity to travel. And this very iconic photo that I used was taken in Dublin sometime in the early 1960s. And it shows a member of the Daughters of Charity who wore that very distinctive headgear, the coronet, which led to them being nicknamed the Butterfly Nuns. And she's there just, standing at a bus stop. Looks like she's probably talking to somebody, because I think, it's very unlikely that a nun would have gone out in public and, let her hair slip loose. So certainly, for a long time, nuns would have been, they always, would have been quite, almost everywhere, certainly in Ireland. So just because they wouldn't have left descendants behind doesn't mean that they weren't important. And sometimes, you will find nuns in the family tree of some very surprising people. For example, those of you who are fans of the Irish author James Joyce may not be familiar with his Cork connections. And in fact, his grandmother, Ellen O'Connell, briefly entered a convent in Cork. The She lasted about 6 months before it was mutually agreed that they should, that she should, part ways with the nuns and try her luck in the outside world. But her sister entered the convent a few years later and actually thrived in there, eventually becoming Mother Superior for a few years. So, you never know where you will find them. Now, when we think of nuns, we think of, old women locked away in a convent, saying their prayers, or maybe we think more of, maybe someone like Sister Michael from Derry Girls. But, they actually had, the different orders had different roles. So some of them would have been involved in teaching. For example, the last few months, I have been doing a lot of research on the Presentation Sisters, an Irish order, which began here in Cork in the 1700s. They were very involved in the education of poor children, so they ran a lot of free schools. A lot of hospitals in Ireland were originally under the patronage of religious orders, such as the Sisters of Mercy. They also ran orphanages, which, looking back, we can see, didn't always turn out that well. Before there was any sort of social welfare system, it was often left up to religious orders, particularly nuns, to run soup kitchens, almshouses, and other types of poor relief systems, pretty much anything that offered an alternative to going into the workhouse. And then, of course, there was social justice, which is something that a lot of modern religious orders have turned their attention to, now that they're no longer as involved in some of the other things. And then there are also quite a lot of contemplative orders still around. These will be those nuns who would still be living in enclosed orders. They limit their interactions with the outside world as much as possible and spend most of their time in prayer inside the convent. And in fact, some even go to the extreme where their only interaction with someone from the outside world might be through, say, like a small little hatch or grating, in the wall of the convent. Now, how exactly can if you have someone in your family tree who was a nun and you are trying to figure out which order they were with, then there are a few tips. We tend to think of, when we think of nuns, as I said, we tend to think of them as kind of looking the same. We sort of have a very fixed idea of what a nun looked like in our head. But the thing is, nearly each order had their own distinctive habits. I said, some would have worn the kind of like typical veil and all that was associated with it. Others might have had something similar to the coronet in the first photo. So there was no single look for a nun. Again, they would focus most typically on just that they would dress modestly. They would probably wear black or gray, or maybe just a dark blue. So each the habits was usually different. And then of course, the habits might also distinguish between the novices and those who had been fully professed within the order. For most nuns, it was typical that they would take a new name upon entering the convent, that once they had taken their vows, they would adopt a religious name, which was usually the name of a particular saint. And sometimes you will actually find that there are, so I suppose, similar to what there would be in terms of family naming traditions, some religious orders will have, the same religious names which crop up time and time again. So maybe, you might find lots of Sister Agnes's or Sister Ursula's, etc. Occupations, as it's, talked in the earlier slide about the type of roles they would have. But then, so, were they primarily teachers? Were they working mostly in hospitals? And this is actually quite important because religious orders were, when they set up and they said, okay, we are going to focus on this particular role, especially before Vatican II sort of opened up the convents and gave them more options, they would have stuck to it. And sometimes this actually led to conflicts with the, religious hierarchy in particular diocese, maybe, with the parish priests or with the bishops. That maybe a bishop in the US with a large Irish immigrant community writes to Ireland and he said, okay, I need a group of nuns to come out here and set up some schools because, we want our children to be educated in the Catholic tradition. We don't trust the mainly Protestant run American school system. And then the nuns get out there and the bishop, that's everything's fine. Maybe this order of nuns were primarily focused on educating the poor Catholic children. But then a lot of the wealthier parishioners approach the bishop and say, well, we want the school for our children, but we don't want to be sending them to the same school as all these, poor, unwashed. And, the bishop might turn to the nuns and say, well, we want you to set up this, school for the rich people as well. But if the nuns have, if it is in their charter that they will only educate the poor, then, this could end up with conflict. So it is important to keep that in mind. I mentioned already about, immigrant communities, and it was actually quite common, particularly in the 1800s, where parishes may be broken down along, the nationality of the migrant community. So, you might have an Irish church, you may have an Italian parish, maybe you'll have, say, a Polish parish, etc. And quite often the religious orders that operated within these communities would have come from that immigrant background. Now, that's not a definite, sometimes there was crossover, but you may have a situation that as, say, the Irish community moves from area to area, that, the religious orders might actually follow them. Location, I said, so, if you have a particular group of nuns who are already focused on educating the poor or working in hospitals, then it's unlikely that you would have another order doing exactly the same thing. Especially, particularly in a period when there was a lot of suspicion directed towards immigrant Catholic communities, you had the Know Nothing Party, etc. These groups, they tried to be discreet, and there was often worries that, oh well, if you've too many religious orders in this area, then there will be a backlash. Post-nominals are very important and often sometimes can be the best clue for identifying which community that your religious ancestors were involved with. And so here are some examples of them. So you have the presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Presentation Sisters, OSC, Order of St. Clare, Poor Clares, ORSM, Religious Sisters of Mercy, Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who are the Loretto Sisters, Order of St. Ursula, Ursulines. So, there are hundreds and hundreds of different post-nominals out there. And quite often you will find that maybe either on the gravestone or in the obituary that you might see this, this post-nominal next to them. And it can be very useful, because I had one of my mom's aunts, I knew she was a nun. I found her obituary, and all it really said was, oh, she was described her as a Franciscan sister. But the problem is that there are something like dozens of different Franciscan nuns. So, it took a bit of digging, and the post-nominals offered a bit of a clue for narrowing down just which particular Franciscan order she had been part of. Now, if you are looking for, the records for religious orders, what should you expect to find? Well, the convent annals, where they survive, they can often be the best way of finding out what was going on. They won't tell you a lot about what was happening in the outside world, but they will give you a lot of clues for what was happening within the convent, especially in terms of admissions. So they might say that, such an Mary McCarthy from Skull, West Cork, entered the convent on this day. Then maybe 2 or 3 years later, oh, Mary McCarthy came to us in such a year, has now taken her vows and has taken the name, Sister Agnes as her religious names. So then, you can look through the annals and say, okay, well, what references are there to this Sister Agnes? Did she, take on any senior roles within the convent? Did she, spend, maybe she may have been part of a group that went out to set up a new community elsewhere, etc. And then, when they died, that is probably where you will find a sort of, maybe a little obituary for them. The account books, convents are no different to any other organization. They need to balance the books. They need to keep track of their spending, what donations did they receive, etc. If the religious order ran a school, there's a very good chance that they will have a school register. And school registers can be fantastic, because they will often list, what age was the child when they began school, what was their address, and what occupation did their father have. And quite often, for girls who decided to enter a religious order, it was because they had been educated by that order. And so, they just spent so much of their time going up around these nuns and decided, well, I want to be part of that community. There will usually be, aside from what's in the annals, there will usually be some records of admissions to the convent, professions, when did they take their vows and, become full members of the community, and then elections to senior roles. Again, I don't know about all religious orders, but certainly those I've researched were quite democratic. They elected the Mother Superior for a certain number of years. They would have elected the bursar, the mistress of novices, etc. The only difficulty, though, is that prior to Vatican II, you will probably only find the bare details, but certainly afterwards, you may start getting a lot more information. You may get like a full sort of, record of their career within the order, especially if they were a teacher. Gravestones, as genealogists, we love graves. Gravestones can be absolutely fantastic for researching nuns, particularly where you have an actual, the actual convent graveyard. Oral histories can actually be, you may not think of it, but there has been a move in recent years to record a lot more oral histories for nuns, particularly because so many of these convents are closing. Religious orders are in steep decline. And it is, it's regarded as very important to record these stories while there is still time. Because in a few more generations, these convents could be completely gone. A lot of these religious orders may no longer exist, and we'll have lost that vital connection to the past. So here is a fantastic image of a religious burial ground. I was actually spent the last few months researching a lot of these graves. This is the graveyard for the South Presentation Convent in Cork City. It's now the Heritage Centre as well for Nagle Place. And most of the burials here would be of the Presentation Sisters, but there are also some Ursulines among them as well, because for a brief period, the two communities were, occupied had convents kind of, side by side. And, you never know. Sometimes you may even find other religious orders among them. It wasn't unusual maybe for, maybe a particular, convent just didn't take off, maybe it failed, and there was no place to put their deceased. So they looked to the burial ground of a nearby religious order instead. So again, where can you actually look for records of nuns? Most religious orders should have an archive. Now, I say most because, getting access to them, not always easiest, but there was actually a decree by the Vatican in the 90s called the Pastoral Formation of Church Archives, and it essentially said, basically, the instruction to religious orders was, it is your religious duty to maintain an archive. Now, I said, sometimes gaining access to them may not be so easy. This is the archives for the Congregation Archives for the Presentation Order here in Cork. They have an absolutely amazing archive. It's relatively modern, state of the art. But during my research, I was trying to get access to the records for some of the other nearby religious orders, and it was essentially silent. And it wasn't until I asked the presentation archivist, I asked her advice, and she said, I'll make some phone calls. So, if in doubt, talk to another local archivist. They may have some contacts or have some suggestions on how you go about actually finding out, does that religious order have their own archive? Sometimes especially in a situation where the convent has closed down, their records may have been deposited elsewhere. So, maybe they went to the diocesan archives, and diocesan archives can be their own major headache. Maybe the local state or county archives ended up taking in their records. This can be especially true when it comes to school records. If there is a Catholic university in your area, then there's a possibility that they may have been the ones who took on the archives. Local historical societies, maybe they have, maybe they ended up with some of the records. And then, of course, Catholic directories and newspapers can offer a very useful clue as well. Particularly, say, if you had a relative who was in a religious order and went off on the missions, there are usually a few, Catholic newspapers, or at least there were anyway, devoted to various missionary groups and sort of, reporting on their activities. So, those are all potential areas where you may find some information. So, thank you for that. I hope this was helpful.